An immigrant taxi driver returned a millionaire's purse. The words echoed in Alejandro Reyes' mind as he scanned the morning newspaper's headline, his own face staring back at him from a grainy photo he hadn't known was taken. Fame was the last thing he'd wanted when he turned in that designer handbag 3 days ago. Now his phone wouldn't stop ringing. The taxi smelled of pine air freshener and faded dreams. Alejandro had scrubbed the vinyl seats that morning as he did every day, erasing all evidence of the strangers who briefly inhabited his world. 7 years in America, and his taxi remained the only space that felt truly his. A metal cocoon shuttling between towering buildings that never quite felt like home. His calloused fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he navigated Manhattan's morning traffic. The rhythm of the city pulsed around him, honking horns, screeching brakes, pedestrians rushing with their steaming coffee cups. All of it familiar, yet forever foreign. Each fare brought him $13 closer to bringing his daughter Lucia from Honduras. At 16, she was growing up in photographs and pixelated video calls, her face changing in ways that made his heart ache with every new image. The letter from Immigration Services was folded in his breast pocket, its edges worn from constant handling. Fourth rejection. The words had blurred before his eyes when he'd first read them 2 weeks ago. Insufficient evidence of extraordinary contribution. Failure to demonstrate exceptional circumstances. The same bureaucratic language that had haunted him for years. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then a sudden downpour that transformed the city into a glistening, blurry landscape. Alejandro switched on his wipers and availability light. These were the moments, caught between destinations, watching raindrops race down his windshield, when loneliness pressed heaviest against his chest. His phone vibrated. Lucia. He would answer later when he could summon the strength to lie about how well things were going. 73rd and Park Avenue, came the dispatch voice through his radio. The Upper East Side. Rich people who rarely remembered his face and tipped according to whatever mood possessed them that day. Alejandro made a U-turn, his tires splashing through puddles that reflected the city lights like fallen stars. The woman was standing under the awning of a gleaming residential building, wrapped in a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than 3 months of Alejandro's rent. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, her posture rigid despite the Louis Vuitton purse weighing down her right shoulder. Even drenched in rain, she exuded the confidence of someone who had never worried about having enough. "Good morning," Alejandro said as she slid into the back seat, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume that momentarily overpowered the pine air freshener. "Morning." Her voice was clipped, distracted. "Metropolitan Museum, please." In the rearview mirror, Alejandro watched her pull out a phone, her manicured fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Another call, another meeting, another day in a life utterly different from his own. He pulled away from the curb, focusing on the road ahead. "Actually," she suddenly said, "can we stop by my office first?" 61st and Madison. "Of course, ma'am." They rode in silence, two strangers sharing space but living in different worlds. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof of the taxi. Through the windshield wiper's hypnotic rhythm, Alejandro caught glimpses of a city that had promised so much and delivered so little. When they arrived at a towering glass building, the woman was already reaching for her wallet. "Wait here, please. I'll just be 5 minutes." She hurried out, leaving behind the lingering scent of her perfume and the soft leather purse on the seat. Alejandro's eyes widened. He turned around to call after her, but she had already disappeared through the revolving doors. The purse sat there, abandoned, vulnerable, so casually forgotten by someone who could afford to be careless. He reached back and picked it up. The leather was butter soft, the gold hardware gleaming even in the dull light of a rainy morning. Something about its weight felt significant, as if it contained more than just the usual wallet and cosmetics. Alejandro could have looked inside, could have seen what made this bag heavier than it should be, but there were lines he wouldn't cross. Not even after 7 years of cleaning other people's messes for minimum wage. Not even after 4 rejection letters. He placed the purse carefully on the passenger seat beside him and waited, raindrops marking time on the roof of his taxi. 7 minutes passed, then 12. At 15 minutes, he began to worry. At 20, he made a decision. Taking the purse, he stepped out into the rain and approached the building's security desk. "Excuse me," he said to the guard, whose eyes immediately narrowed at his taxi driver uniform. "A passenger left this in my cab. She came in here about 20 minutes ago." The guard looked at the purse, then at Alejandro, suspicion evident in his gaze. "Name?" Alejandro faltered. "She didn't say." "Dark hair, cream coat. Going to the museum after this." The guard picked up his phone, spoke briefly, then pointed to the waiting area. Someone will be down. Alejandro sat on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than his monthly earnings, the purse on his lap feeling increasingly heavy. Water dripped from his jacket onto the polished marble floor. When the elevator doors opened, it wasn't the woman who emerged, but a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. His silver hair and commanding presence seemed to part the air around him. "You found Catherine's purse?" His voice carried the polished accent of old money and private schools. Alejandro stood, extending the bag. "Yes, sir. She left it in my taxi." The man didn't immediately take it. Instead, he studied Alejandro with piercing blue eyes. "You looked inside?" "No, sir. It's not my business." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken assessments. What's your name?" the man finally asked. "Alejandro Reyes." "Well, Mr. Reyes, my daughter would be quite distressed to lose this particular bag. There are items inside far more valuable than the bag itself." He finally took the purse, its weight transferring from Alejandro's hands to his. "Wait here." Before Alejandro could protest that he had fares to collect, the man had turned back toward the elevator. The minutes ticked by, each one representing lost income. Alejandro checked his watch repeatedly, calculating how many more hours he would need to work to make up for this delay. The immigration letter seemed to burn against his chest from his pocket. When the elevator doors opened again, both the silver-haired man and the woman from his taxi emerged. Her eyes widened slightly upon seeing him. "You brought my purse," she said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes, ma'am." The man stepped forward, extending an envelope. "Catherine tells me you're an excellent driver. Careful, courteous." Alejandro took the envelope uncertainly. "Thank you, sir. I'm Edward Harrington," the man said, as if the name should mean something. "Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Global Investments." Alejandro nodded politely, though the name held no significance for him beyond confirming what was already obvious. This man inhabited a world utterly removed from his own. "There's $500 in that envelope," Harrington continued. "A small token of appreciation. $500, almost a week's worth of fares, for returning something that was never his to keep." Alejandro felt a complex emotion rise in his chest. Gratitude mixed with something like shame. Was his honesty really so surprising? "Thank you, but it's too much," he said, trying to hand back the envelope. Harrington waved him off. "Nonsense. Catherine had important documents in that bag. Consider it proper compensation for your time." The woman, Catherine, was watching him with curious eyes as if seeing him properly for the first time. "Do you have a card? I'd like to request you as my driver again." Alejandro reached into his jacket pocket, passed the folded rejection letter, and retrieved one of the simple business cards he'd had printed at the copy shop on 125th Street. His name, his cell number, his taxi medallion number, evidence of his small place in the world. Catherine took it, her fingers briefly brushing his. "Thank you, Mr. Reyes." As he walked back to his taxi, the envelope secure in his pocket, Alejandro felt the weight of their gaze on his back. He wondered what they saw. A middle-aged immigrant with graying temples and worn shoes, or something more? Something worth $500 and the promise of future fares? The rain had stopped by the time he slid back behind the wheel. Sunlight broke through the clouds, turning puddles into mirrors. Alejandro sat for a moment, allowing himself to feel the warmth of unexpected good fortune. Then he turned on the ignition and pulled away from the curb, back into the flow of a city that rarely slowed for anyone. 2 days later, Catherine Harrington requested his taxi. 3 days after that, she did so again. By the end of the week, Alejandro had driven her to meetings across Manhattan, waited while she attended charity luncheons, and even taken her to JFK for a brief business trip to Chicago. She tipped generously each time, but more surprisingly, she talked to him. Not the superficial conversation he was accustomed to from passengers, queries about traffic or weather that required minimal response. Catherine asked questions about Honduras, about his life before America, about his daughter, and she listened to his answers with an attention that made him increasingly comfortable sharing pieces of himself he usually kept hidden. "Why did you come to New York?" she asked him one evening as they drove along the Hudson River, the setting sun painting the water copper in gold. Alejandro considered the familiar question, usually answered with platitudes about opportunity, but something about Catherine's genuine interest made him offer the truth instead. "My wife died when Lucia was 9, he said quietly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Cancer. In Honduras, we couldn't afford proper treatment. I promised myself no opportunity would ever be beyond Lucia's reach again." He paused, the familiar ache of separation pressing against his ribs. She lives with my sister until I can bring her here. In the rearview mirror, he caught Catherine's reflection. She was watching him, her expression soft with an emotion he couldn't quite name. How old is she now? Catherine asked. 16. Going to be a doctor, she says. Pride warmed his voice despite the underlying sadness. Smart girl. Gets that from her mother. Not from you. There was a smile in Catherine's voice. Alejandro chuckled, shaking his head. I never finished high school. Worked construction since I was 15. He flexed his hands on the steering wheel. The calluses evidence of decades of physical labor before he'd saved enough to lease a taxi medallion. But I read, every night, books from the library. What do you? What do you read? The question caught him off guard. Passengers rarely asked about his interests, as if assuming he existed only within the confines of his profession. History, he admitted. American history mostly, to understand this country better. He didn't add that he also read law books about immigration, trying to find some loophole, some path that had been denied him 4 times already. Admirable, Catherine said. Then after a moment, my father was impressed by you returning the purse. Alejandro shrugged. It wasn't mine. You'd be surprised how many people would have looked inside. Taken something. She leaned forward slightly. There were documents in there worth far more than $500. Business papers? Alejandro asked, curious despite himself. Catherine settled back against the seat. Something like that. When they arrived at her Upper East Side building, Catherine paid the fare and added her usual generous tip. But as she was about to exit the taxi, she hesitated. Alejandro, she said, using his name for the first time, would you be available to drive my father tomorrow? He has some meetings around the city. Of course, miss him. Hecadine. Harrington. Catherine, she corrected gently. I'll text you the details. She stepped out into the evening air, then leaned back in. And Alejandro, thank you for sharing your story. As he pulled away, Alejandro felt something shift inside him. A small, warm current in the cold sea of his solitude. For the first time in years, someone in this vast city had looked at him and seen more than just a service provider. Had asked about his books, his daughter, his dreams. The next morning, Alejandro arrived at the Harrington building 15 minutes early. He had washed his taxi twice, vacuumed every crevice, and was wearing his newest shirt. Edward Harrington was not just another fare. He was Catherine's father, and according to a quick internet search Alejandro had done the night before, one of the wealthiest investment bankers in Manhattan. Harrington emerged from the building precisely on time, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sunlight. He nodded at Alejandro with recognition. Good morning, Mr. Reyes. Catherine speaks highly of you. Good morning, sir. Where are we going today? First stop, my attorney's office on Lexington and 57th. Harrington settled into the back seat, immediately opening his briefcase. The day progressed with a series of stops at law firms, investment banks, and finally, to Alejandro's surprise, a small nonprofit organization in a modest building near Columbia University. Throughout it all, Harrington worked continuously on his phone and laptop, occasionally making calls that involved numbers so large they seemed abstract to Alejandro. At the nonprofit, Harrington asked Alejandro to wait, saying he might be some time. There's a cafe across the street if you need coffee. He added, a small but unexpected consideration. Alejandro did get coffee, returning to sit in his taxi with a paperback copy of Team of Rivals. He kept for such waiting periods. An hour passed before Harrington emerged, accompanied by a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked black hair. They paused on the sidewalk, continuing their conversation with animated gestures. Alejandro couldn't hear their words, but there was something passionate in their exchange. Something that made Harrington seem more human than the cold finance titan portrayed in the business articles Alejandro had read. When Harrington finally returned to the taxi, he seemed energized. One last stop, Mr. Reyes. My home. I'd like you to come inside when we arrive. There's something I want to discuss with you. Alarm bells rang faintly in Alejandro's mind. In 7 years of driving a taxi, he had learned to be wary of unusual requests. But this was Catherine's father, and something about the straightforward way Harrington made the request dispelled his concern. Of course, sir. The Harrington residence was a limestone townhouse on East 70th Street, its elegant facade speaking of old wealth and permanence. Alejandro parked at the curb, following Harrington up the steps with a sense of unreality. People like him did not enter homes like this. Inside, the house was surprisingly warm, not just in temperature but in atmosphere. Rich woods, soft fabrics, and jewel tones. walls lined with books and art that looked meaningful rather than merely expensive. It was nothing like the cold, sterile luxury Alejandro had imagined. This way, Harrington led him to a study lined with bookshelves. Drink? I have an excellent Nicaraguan rum that might remind you of home. No thank you, sir. Alejandro remained standing, though Harrington gestured toward a leather chair. Please sit. It wasn't quite a command, but it carried an expectation of compliance that Alejandro found himself unable to refuse. As he perched uncomfortably on the edge of the chair, Harrington poured himself a measure of amber liquid and sat behind a substantial desk. I understand from Catherine that you've been in this country for 7 years, Harrington began, and that you have a daughter still in Honduras. Alejandro nodded, uncertain where this conversation was heading. She also mentioned you've had trouble with your immigration status. Harrington's blue eyes were focused intently on Alejandro's face. May I ask what specific issues you've encountered? Alejandro's hand instinctively moved to his breast pocket, where the latest rejection letter remained. I applied for permanent residency under extraordinary circumstances. My daughter has a heart condition that would benefit from American medical care. He swallowed hard. They rejected me 4 times now. May I see the letter? Caught off guard, Alejandro hesitated, then slowly withdrew the folded paper. Harrington read it carefully, his expression neutral. The woman I was speaking with earlier, Harrington said, setting down the letter, runs an immigration advocacy organization, one that my family foundation supports quite substantially. He leaned forward. Mr. Reyes, I believe I might be able to help you. Hope, dangerous, painful hope, flared in Alejandro's chest. He immediately tried to extinguish it. He'd learned the cost of false hope. Why would you do that, sir? The question came out more bluntly than he intended. Harrington didn't seem offended. Instead, he smiled slightly. Do you know what was in my daughter's purse, Mr. Reyes? The one you returned without opening? Alejandro shook his head. Documents regarding a merger. Pre-filing notifications that, had they leaked, would have constituted insider trading worth millions to the right people. Harrington took a sip of his rum. But more importantly, a flash drive containing evidence I've been gathering against a former partner who has been embezzling from our clients. Alejandro remained silent, processing this information. You're an honest man, Mr. Reyes. You returned something valuable without looking inside, without seeking advantage. That's rarer than you might think. Harrington set down his glass. I believe in repaying debts. You did me a service. I'd like to do the same for you. I don't understand what you could do, sir. Immigration doesn't care who you know. Harrington laughed, a genuine, warm sound. Oh, Mr. Reyes. Immigration, like most bureaucracies, cares very much about who you know. The organization we visited today specializes in hardship cases like yours. With proper legal representation and a sponsor, your case will be reviewed differently. A sponsor? Alejandro echoed. Yes, I would need to offer you legitimate employment, not as a taxi driver, but at my foundation. We fund infrastructure projects in Central America, among other initiatives. Your knowledge of Honduras would be valuable. Harrington's expression grew serious. It wouldn't be charity. You would work and work hard. But it would establish the extraordinary circumstances that your application has lacked. Alejandro sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment like fragile glass. And my daughter? Once your status is secured, she could join you here. And yes, we have connections with several medical centers that could address her condition. The hope Alejandro had tried to suppress burst forth, flooding his chest with warmth that threatened to overwhelm him. His vision blurred briefly, and he had to blink rapidly to clear it. Why? He asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. The purse ... It doesn't equal all this. Harrington was quiet for a moment. 25 years ago, I was a different man, Mr. Reyes Hermans. Ruthless in business, absent at home. When Catherine's mother died, I was in Hong Kong closing a deal. His voice grew quieter. I missed saying goodbye to my wife because I thought nothing was more important than success. He stood moving to a photograph on the bookshelf. A younger version of himself with a beautiful dark-haired woman and a small girl who was clearly Catherine. After that, I changed how I measured wealth. Yes, I continued to build my business, but I also started the foundation, began to use my influence differently. He turned back to Alejandro. Your honesty reminded me of values I once nearly lost. And your story, working to bring your daughter here for better care, resonated with me. Alejandro found himself standing, though he couldn't remember rising from the chair. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider my offer. Come to the foundation offices on Monday. Meet the team. See if it's something you'd want to be part of. Harrington extended his hand. No obligations. As Alejandro reached out to shake Harrington's hand, he felt as though he were reaching across more than just physical space. He was bridging worlds that rarely intersected, connecting disparate lives through an unexpected act of kindness and a chance encounter with a forgotten purse. "I'll come," he said, his voice steadier now. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." "Edward," the older man corrected. "And thank you, Alejandro, for reminding an old cynic that integrity still exists in this city." The weekend passed in a blur of disbelief and cautious excitement. Alejandro didn't tell Lucia during their Sunday video call. Couldn't bear to raise her hopes until he was certain this unexpected opportunity was real. Instead, he listened to her chatter about school and friends, storing up the sound of her laughter like precious fuel for his soul. Monday morning found him standing outside the Harrington Foundation offices, wearing his only suit, purchased years ago for immigration interviews and grown slightly too tight across the shoulders. The building was modern but understated, nothing like the gleaming towers of Harrington Global Investments. Catherine met him in the lobby. "I was hoping Dad would convince you," she said with a warm smile. "Come on, I'll show you around before your meeting." As they walked through the open plan office, Alejandro observed a diverse staff engaged in animated discussions around project boards labeled with countries he recognized: Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. "We focus on sustainable development," Catherine explained. "Clean water initiatives, renewable energy, educational infrastructure. Dad believes in addressing root causes rather than symptoms." Alejandro nodded, trying to imagine himself in this environment, so different from the solitary confinement of his taxi. "And what would I do here? We need people who understand the regions we work in. Not just the geography, but the culture, the real needs of communities." Catherine stopped by a conference room. "You know Honduras in ways our researchers never will, no matter how many reports they read." Before Alejandro could respond, Edward Harrington emerged from the conference room, accompanied by a petite woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes behind red-framed glasses. "Alejandro, good morning. This is Victoria Mendez, our legal counsel and immigration specialist." Harrington performed the introduction with a warmth that put Alejandro slightly more at ease. Victoria extended her hand. "Mr. Racanal Reyes, Edward has told me about your situation. I've already reviewed your previous applications." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. "I believe we can help you." The meeting that followed was unlike anything Alejandro had experienced in his 7 years of immigration struggles. Victoria didn't speak in vagaries or bureaucratic circles. She outlined a clear path forward: employment with the foundation as a regional consultant, sponsorship from a company with significant influence, and a new application emphasizing his unique knowledge in the humanitarian aspects of his daughter's medical needs. "The key was finding legitimate employment that utilizes your specific background," Victoria explained. "Driving a taxi doesn't qualify as extraordinary skill in immigration terms, but your intimate knowledge of Honduran communities and your ability to liaise between our foundation and local partners potentially does." "How long?" Alejandro asked the question that burned most urgently in his mind. Victoria and Harrington exchanged glances. "With expedited processing," Victoria said carefully, "and considering the foundation's standing with certain officials, we could see movement within 3 to 4 months. 3 to 4 months. After 7 years of waiting, it seemed impossibly fast. "And the position?" Alejandro turned to Harrington. "What exactly would I be doing?" "Initially, consulting on our Honduras projects, reviewing proposals, connecting us with local contacts, ensuring our efforts align with actual community needs." Harrington handed him a folder. "The details are all here, including salary and benefits. Take it home, review it. This isn't charity, Alejandro. It's a job offer based on skills you possess that we need." Alejandro accepted the folder, its weight in his hands feeling somehow momentous. "And if the immigration application fails?" "It won't," Victoria said with quiet confidence. "But even if there were complications, the job offer stands. We believe in second chances here, Mr. Reyes. Second chances." The words echoed in Alejandro's mind as he left the building an hour later, the job offer and preliminary immigration paperwork tucked carefully in his bag. The city around him seemed somehow different. The same buildings and streets, but viewed through a lens of new possibility. That evening, in his small apartment in Washington Heights, Alejandro spread the papers across his kitchen table and read every word. The salary was more than double what he made driving his taxi, even in good months. The benefits included health insurance that would cover Lucia's condition, The job description outlined responsibilities that would challenge him, respect his knowledge, and value his perspective. It seemed too perfect, too miraculous, like a dream from which he would surely wake. His phone rang, Lucia, calling outside their usual schedule. "Papa," her voice came through, slightly distorted by distance, yet achingly familiar. "Are you okay? You seemed strange yesterday." Alejandro hesitated, looking at the papers before him. Should he tell her? Risk her disappointment if this fell through? "I'm fine, mija," he said carefully. "Just, there might be some changes coming. Good changes." "What kind of changes?" The hope in her voice was palpable, making his heart constrict. "I may have found a new job. A better one." He traced his finger over the Harrington Foundation letterhead. "And if it works out, it might help with our papers." The silence on the other end was brief but heavy with meaning. They had learned not to hope too openly, both of them. "Really?" Her voice was small, controlled. "Really?" He allowed himself a smile that he knew she could hear. "I don't want to promise anything yet, but for the first time, I think it might actually happen." "Because of the purse?" Lucia asked. "The one in the newspaper." Alejandro blinked in surprise. "You saw that?" "Tia showed me. It said you returned a rich lady's purse. That you're a hero." Pride colored her voice. Alejandro hadn't known the story had traveled so far. "I'm not a hero, Mija. I just did the right thing." "That's what heroes do, Papa." Her simple logic made him laugh softly. As they talked, Alejandro felt the distance between them begin to shrink. Not just the physical miles, but the emotional space created by years of separation and deferred dreams. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine her here, in this apartment, perhaps in a bigger one they could afford with his new salary. He imagined taking her to doctors who could strengthen her heart, to schools that could nurture her mind. After the call ended, Alejandro made a decision. He reached for his phone again and dialed the number Catherine had given him. "I'll take the job," he said when she answered. "And I'm ready to start the immigration process again." Catherine's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful news, Alejandro. I'll tell Dad. Can you come in tomorrow to sign the paperwork?" "Yes." He looked around his small apartment, at the collection of books that had been his companions through lonely evenings, at the photographs of Lucia that documented her growth in his absence. "Yes, I can come tomorrow." That night, Alejandro slept more soundly than he had in years, his dreams untroubled by the anxieties that had been his constant companions. In the morning, he rose early, watching the sunrise paint his window with golden light. Something had shifted within him. Not just hope, but a quiet certainty that had been absent for too long. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Alejandro sold his taxi medallion, using part of the money to secure a slightly larger apartment in the same neighborhood. Still modest, but with a second bedroom for Lucia. Victoria Mendez prepared his immigration application with meticulous attention to detail, building a case so comprehensive that it stood in stark contrast to his previous attempts. At the foundation, Alejandro discovered untapped abilities within himself. His knowledge of Honduras, not just its geography, but its people, its challenges, its resilience, proved invaluable to the team developing clean water projects for rural communities. His perspective shifted their approach in subtle but significant ways, making their initiatives more practical, more attuned to local needs. Catherine often stopped by his desk, bringing coffee and questions about his daughter. They developed an easy friendship that bridged their different worlds. She showed him photographs of her own children, 2 boys in boarding school, and spoke with surprising candor about her divorce, her complicated relationship with her father, her hopes for the foundation's work. "You've changed him, you know," she said one afternoon as they reviewed maps of potential project sites in northern Honduras. "Changed who?" Alejandro looked up, confused. "My father." Catherine traced a river on the map with her fingertip. "He's always been generous with money, especially since my mother died. But it was distant generosity. Checkbook philanthropy." She smiled slightly. "Since meeting you, he's been different, more engaged. He's going to Honduras next month to see the projects himself." Alejandro considered this, uncomfortable with the weight of such influence. "I didn't do anything special." "You were honest," Catherine said simply. In his world, that's revolutionary. 3 months after accepting the position, Alejandro received a call from Victoria Mendez. His hands trembled as he answered. "They've approved the first stage," she said without preamble. "We have a hearing date, 6 weeks from now." "It's happening, Alejandro." The world seemed to tilt around him. "They approved it?" "Preliminary approval. The hearing is largely procedural at this point. Your employment status and the foundation's sponsorship made all the difference. Victoria's usually businesslike tone softened. And I've already started the paperwork for Lucia. Once your status is confirmed, we can apply for hers immediately. After the call ended, Alejandro sat at his desk, staring at the photograph of Lucia he kept beside his computer. She was smiling in the image, her dark eyes so like his own, yet alight with a hope he had lost and was only now rediscovering. "Soon," he whispered to her image. "Soon, Mia." That evening, Edward Harrington invited Alejandro to his home for dinner. It wasn't their first such meeting. Over the past months, Harrington had occasionally asked Alejandro to join him to discuss foundation projects in a more relaxed setting. But there was something different about this invitation, a formality that suggested significance. When Alejandro arrived, he found not just Harrington but Catherine as well, along with Victoria Mendez and the woman from the nonprofit he had seen on his first day driving Harrington. Now introduced as Elena Diaz, Executive Director of Immigrant Justice Alliance. "We're celebrating," Harrington announced as a housekeeper served drinks in the wood-paneled study. "Victoria tells me your case has advanced to the hearing stage." Alejandro nodded, still overwhelmed by the day's news. "Yes, I don't know how to thank you all." "No thanks necessary," Victoria said crisply. "You've earned this with your work at the foundation. The sponsorship opened doors, but your qualifications made the case." Elena Diaz studied him with warm, intelligent eyes. "Edward tells me your daughter has a heart condition. Have you considered where you'll take her for treatment once she arrives?" "I've researched some clinics," Alejandro began, but Harrington interrupted gently. "The foundation's health insurance will cover treatment at Columbia Presbyterian. I've already spoken with a cardiologist there who specializes in pediatric cases." He raised a hand when Alejandro began to protest. "Standard benefit for all employees, Alejandro. Nothing special." But it was special. All of it was special. This room filled with powerful people who had chosen to help him. This moment of transition from desperation to possibility. This new life emerging from a simple act of returning what wasn't his. "There's something else we wanted to discuss," Catherine said, exchanging glances with her father. "Something that was in my purse that day." Alejandro looked between them, confused. "The business documents?" Mr. Harrington mentioned them. "Yes, but there was something else." Catherine reached into her bag and removed a small leather-bound book. "This journal. It contains ideas for the foundation, projects I've been developing for years while working at my father's company." She passed it to Alejandro, including a scholarship program for immigrants' children to attend college. Alejandro opened the journal, seeing pages filled with Catherine's elegant handwriting, diagrams, calculations, vision statements for programs that could transform lives like his and Lucia's. "I've been trying to convince Dad to fund these initiatives for years," Catherine continued, "but he always saw them as impractical, too idealistic." Harrington cleared his throat. "I was wrong. Meeting you, Alejandro, seeing what one opportunity can do, it changed my perspective." "We're launching the scholarship program next fall," Catherine said, her eyes bright with excitement. "And we want Lucia to be our first recipient." Alejandro stared at them, words failing him completely. The generosity was so vast, so unexpected, that it seemed to fill the room like a physical presence. "She wants to be a doctor," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "And she will be," Catherine said with certainty. "If that's still her dream." Later that night, as Alejandro rode the subway home, the journal clutched in his hands, he felt as though he were traveling between worlds. The life he had known, defined by struggle and separation, and the life awaiting him, filled with reunion and possibility. He thought about the purse he had returned without opening, never knowing it contained not just corporate secrets, but Catherine's dreams for a foundation that would change lives. Never knowing that his simple act of honesty would unlock doors that had remained stubbornly closed for 7 years. The immigration hearing, when it finally arrived, was nothing like the intimidating interrogations of his previous attempts. With Victoria beside him and letters of support from Harrington and the foundation board, Alejandro presented his case to officials who seemed predisposed to approve it. His work visa was granted with a clear path to permanent residency within 18 months. That same day, they filed Lucia's paperwork. With her medical condition and Alejandro's new status, Victoria believed she could be in New York within 2 months. "It's really happening," Alejandro said wonderingly as they left the immigration office. "After all this time, it's happening because you made it happen," Victoria replied. "By being the kind of person who returns a purse without looking inside." 2 months later, Alejandro stood at the international arrivals gate at JFK, his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Catherine and Edward Harrington waited quietly, giving him this moment while lending their silent support. When Lucia emerged through the doors, she seemed both familiar and foreign. Taller than he remembered, her face more mature, but with the same bright eyes that had sustained him through 7 years of separation. She scanned the waiting crowd anxiously. "Lucia," he called, his voice breaking on her name. She turned, saw him, and the world narrowed to the space between them as she ran forward. Her body collided with his, solid and real, and finally here. He lifted her off her feet, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her tears dampen his shoulder. "Papa," she whispered, "I'm home." Over her shoulder, Alejandro met Edward Harrington's gaze. The wealthy man who had changed their lives stood with quiet dignity, his daughter at his side, watching a different kind of wealth being exchanged between father and daughter. Harrington nodded once, a gesture of respect between equals. Alejandro nodded back, holding his daughter close, knowing that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the smallest acts of integrity, like returning a forgotten purse without ever realizing it held the key not just to citizenship, but to coming home.